The sun did not set in Aethelgard. It surrendered. In this cursed corner of the world, the horizon didn't glow with the warmth of a dying day. Instead, it bruised, turning a deep, sickly purple like a wound that refused to heal. As the clock tower struck 6, the transformation began. It was a sound that had echoed through the valley for 500 years, a heavy, metallic tolling that signaled the end of human law and the beginning of the Shadow's reign. "Lock the deadbolts! Cover the mirrors!" the whispers hissed through the cobblestone streets like dry leaves. Within minutes, the bustling market became a graveyard of stalls. Windows were shuttered with heavy oak planks. Iron bars were slid into place. Mothers gripped their children's wrists so hard their knuckles turned white. They knew the history. They knew the tally. In 5 centuries, not a single soul caught outside after the last sliver of light vanished had ever been seen again. But tonight, Elias stood at the edge of the town square, his shadow stretching long and thin toward the dark woods. He was young, fueled by a dangerous mixture of grief and skepticism. His sister had vanished 3 nights ago, leaving behind nothing but a half-finished tea in a cold room. The village elders spoke of the invisible ruler, a man who had traded his soul to ancient nameless gods in exchange for an eternal, unseen throne. They said the laws of men meant nothing to him. The police? They were merely men in uniforms huddled in the station with the lights off, praying they weren't noticed. The courts? The judges had long ago burned their law books to stay warm in the winter. "Elias, get inside, you fool!" a voice cracked from a nearby window. It was old Marek, his eyes wide with a terror that surpassed death. Elias didn't move. He clutched a silver locket in his hand. "If he is a king," Elias shouted into the wind, "then let him show his face. If he has laws, let him name them." The wind died instantly. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but a heavy physical weight. The temperature plummeted. Elias breathed out, and his breath came out as a thick cloud of frost. Suddenly, the gravel near his feet shifted. There was no wind to move it, no animal, just the crunch of a heavy boot pressing down on stone. Then another. Someone was walking toward him. Elias swung his lantern, the yellow light cutting through the gloom, but it revealed nothing. The space in front of him rippled like heat over asphalt. A cold, invisible hand brushed against Elias's throat. It wasn't the touch of a ghost. It was the solid, terrifying grip of a man who simply could not be seen. "The law here," the voice vibrated, not in the air, but directly inside Elias's skull, "is that I am everything, and you are nothing." Elias tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The lantern fell to the ground, the glass shattering with a lonely tinkle. By the time the moon rose over Aethelgard, the square was empty. Only the silver locket remained, lying in the dust as a grim reminder that in this land, the only thing more powerful than the law is the silence that follows it. By dawn, the news of Elias's disappearance had settled over the village like a thick, suffocating fog. But this time, something was different. A black sedan, covered in the dust of the city, pulled up to the village gates. Out stepped Detective Silas Vance. Vance was a man of cold logic and steel nerves. He wore a badge that represented the high courts of the capital, and he carried a gun that had never failed him. To him, the invisible ruler was a fairy tale used to cover up a string of kidnappings.
"I don't believe in ghosts," Vance told the local sheriff, whose hands were shaking so violently he couldn't pour his coffee. "He isn't a ghost, Detective," the sheriff whispered, glancing at the ceiling as if the wood itself had ears. "He is the air we breathe. He is the tax we pay in blood. You can't handcuff the wind." Vance ignored him. He set up his equipment in the town square: thermal cameras, motion sensors, and high-frequency microphones. "If it bleeds, I can catch it. If it moves, I can see it," he muttered. But as night fell for the second time, the technology began to scream. The thermal camera showed a heat signature standing directly behind Vance. He spun around, gun drawn. Empty air. He looked back at the screen. The signature was still there, a human-shaped void of absolute zero. Vance fired. The bullet traveled through the empty space and embedded itself in a stone wall. A low, mocking chuckle echoed through the square. "Your metal is slow. Your laws are written on paper. My laws are written in the marrow of your bones." Vance felt a sharp pain in his chest. His badge, the heavy brass symbol of his authority, began to heat up. It grew red-hot, searing through his coat and burning into his skin. He collapsed, gasping, as his modern world crumbled. The ancient spells protecting the ruler weren't just cloaking him, they were warping reality itself. The sensors on the table crushed themselves into scrap metal as if stepped on by a giant. Vance realized then that he wasn't hunting a criminal. He was an ant trying to arrest a god. The authority of the state, the power of the courts, and the logic of science were nothing more than toys in the hands of the unseen.
The mystery was no longer a shadow. It was a physical weight. Detective Vance, his chest scarred by the white-hot heat of his own badge, found himself in the one place everyone feared, the great archives of Aethelgard. Hidden beneath the roots of a dying willow tree, the archives held the records of the time of lawlessness. 500 years ago, the land was a slaughterhouse of bandits and plague. It was then that a man named Alaric turned to the forbidden. He didn't want to lead, he wanted to endure. Vance's fingers trembled as he turned the vellum pages of an ancient ledger. The ink seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The text described a ritual of the hollow sovereignty. To protect his life and his power, Alaric had used a spell of displacement. He didn't disappear, he shifted his physical presence into the in-between. He became the atmosphere, the floorboards, and the very wind that rattled the shutters. He isn't hiding, Vance realized, his voice echoing in the damp cellar. He is the village itself. The air in the cellar suddenly grew thick, smelling of ozone and old blood. A book flew off the shelf, its pages fluttering like the wings of a dying bird. A silhouette began to form in the dust motes, dancing in the light of Vance's flashlight. It wasn't a man, it was a tear in the fabric of the room. "You seek to understand the invisible?" the voice boomed, vibrating the very stones of the foundation. "To see me is to see the truth of your own insignificance. For 5 centuries, I have been the judge, the jury, and the executioner. I am the law that never sleeps." Vance saw a glimpse of a face, gaunt, eyes like burning coals, skin like cracked parchment, flickering for a microsecond before vanishing back into the void. The ruler wasn't just invisible, he was a living curse, fueled by the collective terror of generations.
The detective understood then. You cannot fight a ruler who has no body to break. You have to break the spell that holds him together.
The sun was beginning its final descent on the fourth day. The atmosphere in Aethelgard was electric, charged with a desperate, underlying current of rebellion. Vance knew that the ruler's power relied on one thing: the silence. The ancient spells were woven from the fear of the people. As long as the villagers remained silent, as long as they accepted the invisible ruler as an inevitable force of nature, his power remained absolute. Vance stood in the center of the village square, not with a gun, but with a megaphone. "Listen to me," he roared, his voice cracking the unnatural stillness of the evening. "He is not a god. He is a prisoner of his own magic. He feeds on your fear, but he starves on your truth." From behind shuttered windows, 1,000 eyes watched. The shadows began to thicken. The ground beneath Vance's feet started to vibrate. The invisible ruler was angry. A violent wind whipped through the square, overturning carts and shattering glass. An invisible force struck Vance across the face, throwing him to the ground. "Speak!" Vance coughed, spitting blood onto the cobbles. "If you want your children back, if you want to see the sun without terror, you must speak the truth of what he has done." One window creaked open. It was the mother of the boy who had vanished first. Her voice was thin, like a reed in the wind. "He took my son," she whispered. The wind faltered. "He took my husband," another voice shouted from a balcony. "He stole our lives," a third cried out. With every word of truth spoken aloud, the invisible became less certain. The air began to shimmer and distort. The spells were cracking. The authority of the shadow was built on the foundation of a lie, and for the first time in 500 years, that foundation was crumbling. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a horrifying revelation. As the chorus of voices rose, the air in the square began to congeal. The unseen could no longer remain hidden behind the veil of magic. The distortion in the air hardened. Slowly, painfully, a figure materialized in the center of the square. It was Alaric, but he was not a glorious king. He was a horrific sight. A man withered by 5 centuries of isolation, his skin translucent, his limbs thin as dry twigs. Without the protection of the spell, the weight of 500 years hit him all at once. He gasped for air, his lungs unused to the weight of the atmosphere. The invisible ruler was nothing more than a terrified old man, trapped in a body that should have turned to dust centuries ago. "My law," he wheezed, his voice no longer a thunderous echo, but a pathetic rasp. The police, seeing a target they could finally understand, stepped forward, but Vance held them back. "He doesn't need a cell," he said, watching as Alaric's form began to turn into gray ash. "The truth has already sentenced him." As the last word of the village's collective history was shouted, the ancient spells dissolved completely. Alaric let out one final silent scream before he disintegrated, his remains carried away by a breeze that felt, for the first time in an eternity, clean. The sun rose the next morning, but it didn't bruise the sky. It was a bright, piercing gold. The villagers opened their doors and left them open. The police station was no longer a fortress of fear, and the courts began the long process of writing new laws, laws written in ink, not in blood. The invisible ruler was gone, leaving behind a village that finally understood power is only invisible when we are too afraid to look it in the eye.
The air inside the hidden archives was not merely cold, it was stagnant, a graveyard of breaths held for 5 centuries. Detective Vance held his flashlight tight, the beam cutting through layers of dust that floated like gray snow. He wasn't just looking for a name anymore, he was looking for the origin of a nightmare. He found it in a tome bound in skin that felt unnervingly warm. This was the Liber Umbrarum, the Book of Shadows. As he turned the crackling pages, the narrative of Alaric began to unfold in a vivid, terrifying prose that seemed to bleed off the paper. In the year 1526, Aethelgard was a jewel of the valley, but jewels attract thieves. An army of mercenaries, driven by a bloodlust that knew no bounds, had reached the village gates. Alaric, the then governor, was a man of peace, a scholar king who spent his days in the very library where Vance now stood. He had 2 daughters, Ilara and Mara, whose laughter was the pulse of the town. When the first torch was thrown onto a villager's thatched roof, Alaric did not pray to the gods of light. He knew they were too slow. Instead, he crawled into the forbidden woods, to the witch of the black roots. "I want to protect them," Alaric had begged, his forehead pressed into the damp earth. "I want to be everywhere at once. I want to see every blade that is drawn against my people before it can strike." The witch's laughter was like the sound of grinding stones. "To be everywhere, you must be nowhere," she had whispered. "To see all, you must be seen by none. I will weave your soul into the very fabric of the valley. You will become the wind, the shadow, and the silence. But remember, Alaric, silence has a hunger that never ends." The transformation was described in agonizing detail. Vance read how Alaric felt his bones turn to mist, his blood becoming the evening dew. That night, the invading army didn't see their deaths coming. Soldiers were decapitated by invisible blades. Tents were set on fire by ghost hands. By dawn, 10,000 mercenaries lay dead, and not a single drop of blood was on a villager's hand. Alaric had won, but the victory was a trap. When he tried to return to his home, to embrace his daughters, his hands passed through their hair like smoke. He cried out their names, but his voice was only the whistling of the wind in the chimney. He watched for decades as his children grew old and died, unable to touch them, unable to be known. Isolation is the mother of madness. 500 years of being a spectator to life turned Alaric's love into a venomous possessiveness. He decided that if he could not be loved, he would be feared. He stopped being a protector and became a jailer. He began to enforce the law of the unseen. No one was allowed to be happy in the light because he was trapped in the dark. He began to take people, not to kill them, but to try and pull them into his realm of invisibility, hoping to find a companion in his eternal loneliness. Vance sat back, the flashlight flickering. He realized that the invisible ruler was a man screaming for a touch he could no longer feel. The ancient spells weren't just magic. They were a prison made of a father's desperate love that had rotted into a tyrant's hate. To stop him, Vance wouldn't need a gun. He would need to break the 500-year-old isolation that kept Alaric's spirit tethered to this world.
As the clock moved toward the final hour, the village of Aethelgard didn't just go dark, it went insane. The invisible ruler had felt Vance's intrusion into his past, and the retaliation was not physical, but a psychological siege. Vance stepped out of the archives and into the village square, but the square was gone. In its place was a distorted landscape of nightmares. The cobblestones under his feet felt like teeth. The sky wasn't black, It was the color of a fresh bruise, pulsing with a rhythmic thumping that sounded like a giant heart buried underground. This was the trial of the veil. Alaric was projecting his own 5 centuries of agony into the minds of every living soul in the village. Vance saw a woman scream and collapse, clawing at her eyes. To her, the air was filled with stinging hornets. He saw a father trying to strangle his own son, convinced the boy was a demon. The ruler was breaking the authority of the mind. If the police and the courts couldn't stop him, he would make sure the people couldn't even trust their own senses. "You think words can hurt me?" The ruler's voice boomed, now sounding like 1,000 cracking glaciers. "I have survived the death of empires. I have watched the sun rise and fall 100,000 times while I remained in the shadows. I am the truth. You are the delusion." Vance felt his own mind fracturing. He saw his childhood home burning. He saw the faces of every criminal he had ever failed to catch, their eyes leaking black ink, whispering that he was a failure. The psychic pressure was a physical weight, pressing him down until his knees hit the gravel. "It's not real!" Vance roared, though his voice sounded small against the psychic storm. He looked at the villagers. Some were weeping, some were catatonic. They were drowning in Alaric's trauma. The detective realized that Alaric's invisibility was his greatest weakness. He hid because he couldn't face the reality of what he had become. The ancient spells were a shield against the shame of 500 years of murder. Vance grabbed a handful of the dirt, real physical dirt, and squeezed it until his fingernails bled. The pain anchored him.